You're listening to the Andrea Tantaros Show with Jason Mattera.
Welcome back to the show. We've been talking about our fiscal problems, among other problems, in Washington, D.C. And joining us now is U.S. Senator Rand Paul of Kentucky. He's the author of Government Bullies, How Everyday Americans Are Being Harassed, Abused, and Imprisoned by the Feds. What a very appropriate title this morning, Senator Paul. Thanks for coming on the show.
Good morning. Glad to be with you guys.
Good morning. So I want to ask you, there's all this talk now, the second fight Republicans have to get control over is this fight on the debt ceiling. And Democrats are already out there demonizing Republicans again in the harshest of terms. How confident are you that Republicans can broker some kind of deal this time around? And do you think there's any kind of political appetite for them to force a shutdown if they don't get their way?
Let me stop laughing just for a minute. Just let me stop laughing before we get to this. How confident am I that we'll have the spine to stand up and do the right thing? Not very confident. I mean, the problem is there doesn't seem to be any evidence that we will stand up and fight on principle. However, that's what everybody's saying. Now that the tax deal's done, we will stand up on spending. I'll tell you what it would take. The only way you can have any leverage on the debt ceiling is if you're willing to go beyond the deadline. The only way you can go beyond the deadline, and I think to do it responsibly, is to pass legislation telling the president that the tax revenue that comes in each month will be directed towards interest on the debt and that he will not default on the debt. That way the markets won't get scared. A lot of people don't realize that we have plenty of tax revenue every month that comes in to pay the interest on the debt. There's absolutely no reason to default. That's a made-up panic. They do that to get you to pass the debt ceiling, but what they want is 100% of spending. Right now, tax revenue comes in every month, pays for about 70% of government. But you could include soldier salaries, the defense, Social Security checks, Medicare checks, and interest on the debt, but very little else. But you could do all of those things and keep going through the deadline and tell the president we have to have entitlement reform.
Senator Paul, Jason Mattera here. Thanks for joining us. Now, I know that Harry Reid is trying to push under the radar what's called filibuster reform, which is just a fancy way of saying he's going to try to limit debate and limit amending bills so they can continue to push through Barack Obama's radical left-wing agenda. Why don't you tell us about that?
Well, here's the thing. If they do that, people who have minority voices, people who are ideologically of a minority will no longer have a voice in our country. And I'll give you a quick example. I stood up on the Senate floor, and I didn't filibuster, but I did threaten to gum up the works, which basically is threatening to, unless I got an amendment. And my amendment said that your banking records, your emails, your texts, are your own property. Unless you're accused of a crime and a judge has a warrant, the government's not allowed to look at these things. Now, I'm a minority. It's a defense of the Fourth Amendment, and only 12 senators voted for my amendment. But that voice will be squelched if you get rid of the filibuster, because people like myself who aren't in the majority at this point will not be able to express that opinion. So I'm absolutely opposed to what he wants to do.
And isn't it even more important now that we've seen how this fiscal cliff deal, Harry Reid essentially pushed it through with Senator McConnell, not giving the rest of the Senate any time to read it. It wasn't publicly scored. We know there's like $444 million for Hollywood lunatics in there, money for electric scooters. And what Harry Reid is trying to do by limiting the filibuster, this is why it's so important, is he's trying to stop senators like you from bringing a spotlight to all these extraneous material that is just pushed in by special lobbyists right here in Washington, D.C.
Well, and here's what the American people need to know. The fiscal cliff that we've been talking about nonstop for 2 weeks, you know when it was instituted? 10 years ago. So we've known for 10 years this deadline was coming, and we did absolutely nothing. That
they made it worse.
To do with the filibuster, that's poor planning.
Wouldn't you argue
for 10 years?
Senator Rand Paul, we've actually made it worse. The fiscal cliff is something that members of Congress have created. The big spenders have created. This is a self-imposed fiscal cliff, and we've spent it on a lot of things that a lot of people don't agree with. Today, big, huge story out there that the new government in Egypt, which is run by the Muslim Brotherhood, is scheduled to begin taking delivery of 10 F-16 fighter jets and 200 Abrams tanks, courtesy of U.S. taxpayers. And this $213 million deal is part of this larger foreign aid package that was signed when Mubarak was in office. Now, of course, it's the Muslim Brotherhood. But there's a chorus of critics that say it's time to pull the plug on this kind of spending, especially with what's happening in the Middle East. What do you think?
I'm one of the loudest critics of this, and I've just been appointed to the Foreign Relations Committee, so you can believe that I'm going to be pointing this out. I've said it over and over again. I've said it repeatedly. We should not send money to these countries. My fear is that someday that the money and arms that we are giving to these countries will be used either against the United States or against Israel, and I'm absolutely opposed to this. I think it's a huge mistake, and if we give them any aid, it ought to be contingent upon behavior. Countries like Pakistan need to free that doctor, Afridi, who helped us get bin Laden. Egypt has to say and prove that they will guard our embassy. Libya needs to turn over the people who assassinated our ambassadors. All kinds of restrictions need to be placed on this aid if we're to give it at all. But the bottom line is we got to borrow it from China to send it to Egypt. So it doesn't make any sense. And ultimately, I think these arms may be well used against our own interest.
Well, yeah, you see the 200 Abrams tanks. You can almost imagine them plowing over the hills right into Israel. I mean,
it gives them a couple thousand now. It's 200 in addition to what they have. I think they may either have 1,000 or 2,000 already. And so they have the largest tank army, one of the largest in the world, but definitely the largest in the African continent. And, yeah, I would be quite worried about that. And we have this debate all the time. Everybody's talking about Iran, and I know Iran is important. But to me, I think it may be even more important right now, the arms that we're sending to all of the enemies of Israel throughout the Middle East.
And what's ironic is Egypt used to be an ally of Israel. Egypt was the one, Mubarak was the strongest ally, keeping the peace. I don't have to tell you that. But it was making sure everybody else behaved. Now that this administration has encouraged and actually urged Mubarak to step down, and we have the Muslim Brotherhood, that kind of guarantee isn't there anymore. And I know that you're actually heading to Israel. So I got to ask you, your father, a lot of critics said, was against foreign aid. Some said he was anti-Israel. They thought that he had a Jewish problem, and he did have some, I guess, some disputes on foreign policy issues. So are you taking this trip to put some distance between you and your dad?
Well, I think more of it was that I think he was unfairly characterized. If you ask him who his three greatest intellectual heroes are, they're all Jewish. So there's never been any sort of Jewish problem other than that he did talk about foreign aid, and so do I. But I think sometimes that gets misinterpreted. People think, oh, you're just talking about Israel. And in fact, I spend most of my time emphasizing that most of this foreign aid I'm talking about is going to enemies of Israel. And so some of it's just a different way of expressing it. Some of it is that we will be slightly different on some policy. But really, the bottom line is that I want to be part of the national debate, and I think part of it is getting to know and meeting personally some of the leaders over there. So I will meet with leaders from Israel, leaders from Jordan, as well as leaders from the West Bank, and try to get to know firsthand more about the problems and see if I can be part of the solution.
Senator Paul, Jason Mattera here again. You're a big proponent of the balanced budget amendment, which every American family essentially has to abide by in their own personal lives. Their revenue has to match their spending. Should the next big debate over raising the debt ceiling, should Republicans only raise the debt ceiling if Barack Obama, Harry Reid, and the rest of the Democrats abide and adopt a balanced budget amendment?
Absolutely, and that's been my position from the last debt ceiling. I've said I will vote to raise the debt ceiling under one condition, and that's that we attach a balanced budget amendment to the Constitution. We called it last year when we did it, we called it cut, cap, and balance. And I have a feeling that many of us are going to want to introduce that again. It will take great leverage, though. In order to get the Democrats to agree to something they don't want to do, we would have to go through the deadline. We would have to say we're going to pay our bills, and we'd have to be willing to stand fast. That's been the problem up there, is that when you hear people quietly talk, they're all like, oh, yeah, we got to cut spending, but nobody's willing to go through the deadline. You have to be willing to go through the deadline on the debt ceiling, not raise the debt ceiling, but reassure the markets that you will pay the interest on the debt from tax revenue. If you did that, I think you would create a scenario where we could maybe get to a balanced budget amendment. The reason we need it is every year we pass rules and then Congress doesn't obey their own rules. We pass limits on spending and we exceed them. We say that you have to read the bills and they have to be online, and then they break those rules. So really they need stronger rules, and the only way I can imagine is to do what Jefferson said, and that's that we should have to balance our budget.
We're talking to Senator Rand Paul of Kentucky. Senator Paul, one of the biggest cultural issues and policy debates is now on marijuana. And I know that you've said before that states should be allowed to make a lot of these decisions going forward. Is it too much of a burden, though, on these states and these localities to try and do this type of thing? And do you see them in violation of the drug laws, the federal drug laws that are on the books?
You know, I have a lot of mixed feelings about this. I see the harm to teenagers. I don't think marijuana is a benign drug. I don't think kids should use it. And so I want to always preface what I say with that I don't encourage the use. I think it takes away from your ambition. It makes it harder for you to succeed in life if you're someone who routinely uses marijuana. That being said, if your teenage son or my teenage son gets caught with it, I don't want them in prison for 20 years. And this is getting to be an accepted position. Pat Robertson actually is in favor of legalization now. Many other evangelicals, Jerry Falwell, before he died, was asked, what would you want to do with a teenager in your church? Would you want to put him in jail or give him counseling? And really, I think most reasonable people are now saying, well, yeah, if we're going to punish them, let's at least do it in a reasonable way. We have federal laws that if there's an accidental death, if two teenagers go out, one of them dies from an overdose, maybe alcohol and some drugs, and dies, the other teenager, if they provided the drugs to them, can get 20 years mandatory sentence, no parole, no probation, and no consideration by the judge, an automatic sentence. I'm going to try to get stuff like that taken off the books. And I think if we work that way as Republicans, we may be able to get some of the youth to come back to us who sees Republicans as just a bunch of old people who want to lock kids up forever for using drugs.
Yeah, absolutely. When you started talking about smoking dope gives you a lack of ambition, makes it harder to succeed, I got to wonder if some of your colleagues are hitting the pipe on Capitol Hill, because there's really no ambition to cut spending. No one seems to want to succeed nowadays. They're not winning these fights. Well, I hope you have a safe trip to Israel. You can make some new friends because, of course, Senator Paul, a president would have to have a good relationship with those leaders. Now, wouldn't he, Senator Paul?
Oh, well, you know, we'll have to see. But you're right. I think it is important. And, you know, I'm already part of the national debate, and I do want to be more.
Are you going to run? Are you thinking about running?
You know, we'll have to wait and see. I haven't said no, and what I haven't also said yes, but I am interested in being part of the national debate. I also think the Republican Party, in order to grow and win national elections again, we're going to have somebody a little bit different than we've had in the past, someone who can appeal to people in New England, on the West Coast, someone who has a little more of a libertarian-Republican approach, I think would have a better chance with independents and moderates. And so, you know, we'll think about it.
Well, we'll be watching you, Senator Paul. Thanks for coming on the show. And I know you said, I haven't said no, I haven't said yes. I said that to a guy once. I ended up dating him for 5 years. So that's just a good indication. Senator Rand Paul of Kentucky, everybody, author of Government Bullies, How Everyday Americans Are Being Harassed, Abused, and Imprisoned by the Feds. You can follow him on Twitter, Senator Rand Paul. Thank you so much for joining us. You're listening to the Andrea Tantaros Show with Jason Mattera. Give us a call and let us know what you think about what Paul had to say, or about a president, Paul.